Assalamu alaikum and welcome to today's Sufi teachings. This Sufi teaching series we call Community Connection occurs on the first Sunday of every month at 5 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. It is organized and underwritten by Sufi Center Minnesota with the intention of making the Sufi teachings of peace, love, mercy, justice, freedom, and beauty available to people everywhere. We acknowledge that the land Sufi Center is located on is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Dakota and Mdewakanton tribes. Sufi Center Minnesota recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We're excited and grateful to have Maryam Thea Elijah with us today. Maryam Thea Elijah has been gratefully on the Sufi path for more than 20 years. She is also an acupuncturist and herbalist, hence her ongoing delight in exploring the intersection of spiritual practice and the principles of healing. She lives in southern Vermont, and her home is a zawiya for at least the last 3 days of every month, and please communicate in advance if you wish to attend. Her teaching today is Forgiveness and Accountability in Community Life. Maryam, welcome, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Let me begin by telling a story. It's the story of two very, very good friends, Abdul Ghaffar, which means servant of the divine quality of forgiveness, and Hasiba, which means reckoning or accountability. Abdul Ghaffar and Hasiba are Sufi community leaders. Hasiba holds dhikr at her house on Sunday evenings and Abdul Ghaffar on Thursdays. One Sunday evening, Abdul Ghaffar got totally drunk on Allah at Hasiba's dhikr circle and felt all the inner worlds opening. After dhikr, everyone sat around together and he gave teaching after teaching from deep inspiration. Many beloveds experienced profound direct transmission of the deep love, and several newcomers took hand through Abdul Ghaffar then and there. On his way home afterwards, pulling out of Hasiba's driveway, Abdul Ghaffar ran over and smashed a whole little row of solar lights along the driveway's edge. There were no further casualties, and Abdul Ghaffar arrived home in a very high station, filled with Allah's holy love. Abdul Ghaffar came by the next day to thank Hasiba for hosting the amazing dhikr that had so completely opened his heart. He found Hasiba kneeling among her broken solar lights and asked her, "Hey, what happened?" Hasiba explained, "Last night you were so majdub, brother, that you ran right over them without noticing. I don't think any of them can be repaired. They're pretty thoroughly smashed." Abdul Ghaffar fell to weeping holy tears filled with light. He cried, "Oh, my holy sister, let there be no separation between our hearts. I was drunk with the light of Allah, and I meant no harm. Please forgive me." Hasiba was flooded with grace, and her heart opened to the divine quality of forgiveness. As tears of light filled her own eyes, she said, "Let there be no separation between us. I forgive you, my holy brother." They made dhikr together in the celebration of the unity of hearts, and Allah was with them in the deep and holy way. At last, Abdul Ghaffar once again thanked Hasiba for her mercy, her kindness, and her really amazing dhikr circle, then said goodbye and went home. Hasiba stood there for a while, thinking what a beautiful holy brother Abdul Ghaffar is. But true to her name, there was also something else on her mind, namely the reckoning of the price of little solar lights that cost $5.99 before tax, 6 of which were now broken. Given that they were broken in a holy way, did this mean that she was blessed to eat the cost of replacement? What do you think? The following Thursday, Dhikr was scheduled to be held at Abdul Ghafar's house as usual. Hasaba was planning to skip it this week because she was going to be driving Hawla, another sister in the community, to the airport and didn't think she'd make it back quite on time for the start of the zikr circle. But Abdul Ghaffar called her up and said that he still felt shaky from the expansion he had experienced at Hasaba's dhikr circle and would deeply appreciate her leadership that night, as he didn't feel that he would be able to lead. Hasaba told Hawla that she couldn't drive her to the airport, and so Hawla had to do a fairly expensive Uber, which she couldn't really afford. Then at the last minute, Abdul Ghaffar sent a group text saying dhikr at his house was canceled. He'd received an order that he needed to be in Zawiya alone that night. Hasaba called Abdul Ghaffar, and in listening to him, it felt clear to her that he was receiving true guidance. And yet Hasaba was not sure how she felt about this or what to say about it. How would you feel about it? What would you say? After a few more holy incidents like this involving canceled plans with financial consequences, breach of confidentiality, property damage, and lost car keys, all of which were the result of Abdul Ghaffar either receiving direct guidance or being lost in holy ecstasy, Hasaba realized that it was time to have an important community conversation. She began by asking Abdul Ghaffar to read and write with her pages 103 to 106 from Reality of Imagination, the sixth door, the difference between the Gnostic knower and the one acquainted with knowledge. I'm going to read an excerpt from this out loud, and it will take a while, and it will not be easy to understand with your mind. Don't worry about following it exactly. Just let the transmission wash through you. And afterwards, Hasaba and Abdul Ghaffar will have a very good discussion about what it all means. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. When Abu Yazid, radiallahu anhu, was asked, would the one acquainted with knowledge disobey? He answered, indeed, the command of Allah is a measured decree. The one acquainted with knowledge, those people who enjoy the divine attentive care, can still be disobedient because of the predestined decree that is executed through them. However, their disobedience is not because they meant to transgress the limits set by Allah, nor is it to make what is forbidden permissible, because these types of sin do not issue from them as they issue from others. This is because faith is engraved in their hearts, and it prevents this from happening. The one whose veil is lifted witnesses this matter, and he will observe the etiquette of hearing. This station results in a bewildered state and takes away the intellect that is charged with obligatory duties, and the Gnostic remains without distinction with the guardian like the angels. Disobedience does not occur with the faithful believer, except because of forgetfulness or heedlessness, or by getting an explanation that returns it to its origin. But if the same action occurred by the possessor of witnessing, it is not even named disobedience, even though the ordinary might call it so, because of the cloudiness that exists upon the eyes of the veiled. Allah excuses the Gnostics for their rejection of action. In reality, the doer was not really committing any disobedience. This is because Allah's people are totally consumed in fana, and that annihilates the possibility of any opposition to Allah, but people do not recognize their infallibility. People are of two categories. The first category, this includes those who only act in accordance with what is permissible, and even though some of what is called disobedience according to the law of the Ummah might manifest through them, they are granted a favor from Allah because they used to commit sins, but they knew that they had a Lord who forgives and brings everyone to account. So they repented until they arrived at the station in which it was said to them, act as you will, for I have forgiven you. And they heard it as the people of Badr did. In this case, all the rulings concerning mistakes are abrogated. So in reality, they do not commit disobedience because they actually do what is permissible for them. So whoever has this station, let him know that he has not committed anything to be ashamed of, in spite of the outside tongue that blames him for committing disobedience. Because even though the outer picture may be similar to that of one who really did commit disobedience, the inner ruling is different in each case. The second category, this includes people who have looked at the secret of predestination and how fate rules over creation. They experience the actions decreed for them as mere actions, not in connection with the ruling related to these actions. This occurs in the presence of pure light. In this presence, Allah's people say that all of Allah's actions are good, and there is no doer except Allah. There is no action except Allah's. The story of Musa sallallahu alaihi wasallam with Al-Khidr radiallahu anhu, who killed an individual, demonstrates this subtle state. Look at how Musa sallallahu alaihi wasallam judged it, and look how Al-Khidr judged it. There is a big difference between the two judgments, but each of them was right concerning the aspect of reality that each saw. However, the state of Al-Khidr is the state of the people of the witnessing. They are able to see what is decreed before it occurs in this physical existence, and they do what they do with insight. They have evidence from their Lord, and this is a station that cannot be attained unless Allah becomes the hearing and the seeing of the Gnostic. You ask, should the restrictive law or punishment ordained by the Holy Book be applied to the possessor of witnessing? Know that whoever arrives in this world and attains the age of puberty, when his intellectual capacity is established and he is charged with obligatory duties, the restriction of the law will never be lifted from him in this world, because divine speech has not indicated that it should be so. The law must be applied because it is the rule in this world, not because it is his inner state. In his inner state, the Gnostic was given the analogy that lifted the restriction of the law. However, it is still necessary to apply the law in this world according to its rules. But when the promise of the final world arrives and we will all move to it, the rulings in this lower world will not be applicable anymore. This means that ordained rights will be abrogated in the world of contentment, and this holds true for the one to whom Allah shows his grace, while another may be shown misery. In spite of this knowledge, the restriction of the law and the ordained obligations cannot be abrogated for either the contented or the miserable in this world. This is because the laws were legislated to serve the benefit of this world and the final world as well. So it is impossible to abrogate the restrictions set by the law as long as this lower world remains and as long as the person remains in it. If it were not so, the law would have been abrogated for the one whose veil is lifted, because he does not see a doer except Allah, and Allah does not restrict himself. However, no matter how the friend of Allah crosses the scales of the law, his inner state is still secure because of the possibility that exists in the essence of the universally merciful concerning his reality. This is also contained in the permissible scale. Moreover, if he manifests an action that demands punishment according to the outer aspect of the law, which the ruler made constant, the punishment must be carried out, despite the possibility that he is one of the worshippers whom Allah exempts from that which is prohibited for others. And even though Allah might have excused him in the final world, as he did with the people of Badr, when he made their actions permissible, as is narrated in Hadith, do as you will, for I have forgiven you. Notice that Allah did not say that he has exempted you from the law of this world. So the restricted punishment must be applied to him in this world, even though his inner being is free of sin. If it happens that you are one of the judges, you must apply the restricted punishment upon him, and if you do not do so, you will be disobedient and in opposition to Allah's command. When Abdul Ghaffar and Hasaba finished writing, they looked at each other and said, "Wow." Abdul Ghaffar said, "Clearly, when our heart's intention is pure, or when we have made tauba and been purified, Allah forgives us, for indeed Allah is the oft forgiving. Subhanallah. And Hasaba said, yes, Subhanallah. And yet, even when our actions are fully forgiven by Allah, and even when disobedient actions are ordered and decreed for us by Allah, and even when actions that would be considered disobedient in others are not considered disobedient for us, although we are forgiven, we must still be held accountable in this world for our actions, along with their consequences. This means that even if we receive guidance to do something, it's not a free pass here in community life. Abdul Ghaffar thought deeply and said, so maybe that means that I owe you for those little solar lights that I smashed, even though you forgave me completely in the holiness of the moment? Hasaba replied, yes, my dear beloved holy brother. And not only that, because what it says here is that even if you were following guidance, and even if you were moved by ecstatic witnessing, if I don't hold you accountable here in this world for everything you say or do or neglect to do that inconveniences others or creates chaos in our community life, then I am in the wrong in Allah's eyes. Abdul Ghaffar said, wait, run that by me again? Hasaba said, here, let me read this to you right here on page 106 at the end of this section. Notice that Allah did not say that he has exempted you from the law of this world. So the restricted punishment must be applied to him in this world, even though his inner being is free of sin. If it happens that you are one of the judges, you must apply the restricted punishment upon him. And if you do not do so, you will be disobedient and in opposition to Allah's command. Abdul Ghaffar looked very meek for a moment and asked, do you think that I deserve punishment? Hasiba said, no, my sweet beloved brother, but I do think you should pay for those broken solar lights that you smashed. And I do think that we all need to be paying more attention to both forgiveness and accountability in our community life. Hasaba and Abdul Ghaffar kept discussing this chapter and decided that understanding the clear distinction between accountability and forgiveness, between the law of this world and the next, was so important for the community that they decided to do a teaching together about it the next Sunday. Abdul Ghaffar spoke first about the divine quality of forgiveness. I wish that I could do justice to his beautiful speech. Everyone was in tears as his heart overflowed with the grace of forgiveness, a grace of divine origin, which our hearts cannot command. Abdul Ghaffar made it clear that just like love or wisdom or patience or strength, we cannot manufacture these qualities ourselves. They belong to Allah, and we can ask for them, but only Allah can send the light of love or wisdom or patience or strength to us. Just so with forgiveness, we cannot forgive unless the forgiver sends the light of forgiveness to our heart. It can't be forced. We cannot make the light of forgiveness arrive in our heart, nor demand that it arrive in anyone else's heart. We can ask with sincerity, and we can ask our beloveds to ask. Weeping openly in front of his community, Abdul Ghaffar shared his feeling that the reason why he was named Abdul Ghaffar was that he so frequently and so repeatedly found himself needing to ask for forgiveness. Sometimes this forgiveness was forthcoming from others, at other times it was not. What Abdul Ghaffar now realized is that there were times when others hardened their heart towards him or towards each other because they did not know that there is a difference between forgiveness and accountability, and that accountability is important too. Here, Hasaba began to speak with her very grounded, very practical perspective. For instance, remember the time Abdul Ghaffar drove right over my little solar lights along my driveway. I thought that if I forgave him, that meant that I couldn't ask him to pay for the lights, and I couldn't bear to make separation between our hearts, so I forgave him. What I now know is that forgiveness and accountability are two separate things. I can forgive him completely, so there's no separation between our hearts, and on Judgment Day, it will not come between us. But I can also hold him accountable and ask him to pay for replacement lights. In fact, it is obligatory to hold Abdul Ghaffar accountable according to the law of this world. And in fact, I would be wrong if I did not hold him accountable. Now that I know that I can forgive completely and hold accountable, both are much easier because they really are two different things. Forgiveness is a gracious mercy from Allah that dissolves separation between hearts. Accountability is about the justice of earthly law in community life. And here's the relationship between the two of them. Forgiveness comes more easily with people who are willing to be held accountable. So sometimes accountability needs to come first before forgiveness will blossom in our heart. But here's the other side of it. People are much more willing to be held accountable if we hold them accountable without shame or blame. And that happens when we are holding them accountable, but we've already forgiven them. They can feel that we've already dissolved the separation in our heart. So sometimes, even though accountability is important, it's forgiveness that needs to come first. At this point, Abdul Ghaffar burst into tears again. Hasiba waited a few moments, then continued. This is a really big deal. In fact, for me, it's the biggest deal. Now that I know that forgiveness is easier when there's accountability, and accountability is so much easier when there's also forgiveness, I would love for all of us as a community to learn all that we can about both. Let's take a moment as a community to have an embodied experience in our hearts of what all these different words mean. For example, letting yourself imagine that through our actions, we may have offended or harmed or wronged someone. And even if this was unintentional, trust was broken. Now the other person's heart is closed to us. There's separation. How does that feel in our body? What is it like when someone has not forgiven us, even if they're being very nice about it on the surface? Now let yourself remember in your body what it feels like when forgiveness comes and the separation of hearts dissolves. Ya Allah, Ya Allah. Accountability is different. It's an earthly process, usually involving some discussion back and forth, that brings us right into the weeds of the details while not letting go of the grace. Hasiba then invited the community members to join in small groups of 3 or 4 to have some discussion of how these topics were moving through their hearts and through their community. If we had more time, we would probably do that right now. Perhaps there's a future date where we can explore together more deeply. For now, let's move on to the next and very important stage of our journey. When everyone came back together to share their experiences, they found that the community response to understanding the difference between forgiveness and accountability was nearly unanimous. Most people felt that they and the community as a whole had a much greater capacity to forgive than to hold others accountable, up until the point where unspoken and backlogged accountability conversations started closing hearts to the grace of forgiveness. How exactly, they wanted to know, do we hold others accountable in the clean and polite, healthy and holy way? How do we initiate these accountability conversations in such a way that we do not provoke defensiveness or even backlash, especially if the person whom we are holding accountable is of a higher rank than we are and is following guidance? Hasiba and Abdul Ghaffar realized that this was a very deep question and that it would be a good time to take these and other questions into dhikr together. So they did. The very next day, Hasiba happened to be talking to Abdullah Pat Aylward about the Jamia initiative, and she mentioned the discussion taking place in her community. Abdullah Pat mentioned that someone named Maryam Thea Elijah was working on a teaching on this very topic to be given for Minnesota Sufi Center later that month. Hasiba said, "Oh, Abdullah, thanks for letting me know. Do you think that Maryam Thea Elijah would mind if I contacted her?" Abdullah Pat said, "I know Maryam Thea Elijah, and I know that she'd be glad to talk with you about it." Hasiba and Maryam Thea Elijah talked, and Maryam Thea Elijah said, "It is not possible to hold someone else accountable in the clean and polite, healthy and holy way unless you are first able to hold yourself accountable with that same cleanliness." Ugh. That's God's way of saying, I mean. Hasiba said, "Please come to us and talk with us about this before dhikr this Sunday." When she arrived, here's what Maryam Thea Elijah said. Accountability is not just something that happens when we've done something wrong. It's a way of life. It's an aspect of our alignment and inner straightness, from the heights of gnosis to the most basic matters of conduct here in the dunya. In the human body, the alignment is held in the heart at the level where the spine passes through. This is the moral compass of the heart, and it allows us to have an internal sense of straightness, even in situations that are not straight. Take a moment to find this in your own body, because the thought is not the same as the understanding. You might want to put your hand on your heart and then try moving very slowly, forward or back, little to the left, little to the right. It's easier with your eyes closed to feel in your heart, left, right, forward, back. When am I straight? When am I upright? Feeling it from the inside. Your spine will let you know from the inside when you are straight in your heart. Then just for contrast, let's put our hand on our head, forget about our heart and our spine, and say, "I'm right. It's obvious that I'm right." Why? Because I'm right. Notice what that feels like. Let's feel it in our body so that we'll know in the future when we feel like that, we might be right, but we're definitely not in our alignment. So let's come down from our head into our body, hand on the heart to help bring you down and in. Close your eyes so that you can feel from the inside, moving your spine back and forth, a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, until you can feel from the inside what straightness feels like in your heart. A heart that is in alignment with an axis much greater than itself. In fact, let's take another moment for the sheer pleasure of it, to sit together, each of us in our own alignment, individual and solitary, and yet shared. No one can find this for us. We have to find it from the inside. But once we are there, we are all there together. Would you prefer to trade that in for all of us with our hands on our heads, shouting at each other, "I'm right, I'm right, I'm right"? Didn't think so. So let's stick with this, the practice of alignment through the heart. Directly relevant to this, back in the 1970s, a researcher named Herman Witkin did an experiment wherein he set up a slanted room. The floor was slanted, the walls were slanted at the same angle, windows, ceiling, door frames, all part of a uniform slant. Not enormously slanted, but some. In the center of the room, facing the one-way mirror, also slanted, there was a chair bolted to the floor. One at the time, Herman Witkin would tell each experimental subject, "Go into that room and sit up straight in the chair, and we'll let you know when the experiment begins. But that was the experiment. What they found was that fully 50% of the people in the experiment went in and sat down in that chair slanted in order to be congruent with the slanted room. In scientific terms, this is called being externally referenced. In Sufi terms, it's called being caught by the dunya, stopping with the outside picture. The other 50% of the people went in and sat straight in the chair with their spines straight in relation to gravity, even though it put them completely at odds with their entire environment. This is called being internally referenced, though we call it seeing Allah first, walking straight, not going left or right. It is only possible when we are in our own body, able to feel for our own alignment from the inside. We all go through this all the time, right? We get totally caught by the dunya, externally referenced, stopping with the outside picture, and then getting into a wrestling match with it. And then go to a community dhikr circle and find ourselves back in the heart again in alignment. Alignment is not about being in accordance with external human constructs, and it is definitely not a matter of opinion. Alignment is a physical and spiritual capacity to orient within an invisible straightness. Thus, our own backbone forms the needle of our moral compass. It's easier to find our alignment with our eyes closed. Close the door to the dunya, find your alignment within. The next step is much trickier, to open our eyes and our ears and our nose and our mouth and find our way through a jungle of slanted rooms while keeping our alignment within. No wonder we have to pray 5 times a day. No wonder we have so many practices to bring us back again. Let's practice right now. As you see me and hear me, can you feel your own alignment on the inside? You can still hear me speaking. You can still assess what I have to say as input. But how would all of our relationships in community change, including our relationships with teachers, if we made a practice of staying in touch with our own alignment, our own inner compass, while face to face with each other? I dream of community lived on this basis, including between teachers and students, healers and clients, both taking full responsibility for their own alignment and meeting together on that basis. This alignment, the sense of straightness from the inside, not stopping with the outside picture, forms the basis of our sense of accountability, first before God, then within community. Now we're ready to take the next step. And this is where we get into blame and shame, which obstruct clean accountability from taking place. Here we go. The root of the moral compass is the tailbone. The spine goes up and the tailbone in health points down. We all have a tailbone, and believe it or not, we all have in our brain a caudal reflex, a part of our brain that is in charge of wagging our tail, our invisible tail, as the case may be. But the caudal reflex in the brain remains aware of that tail and of our tailbone position. The position of our tailbone has everything to do with our capacity for clean accountability. I call it good dog, bad dog syndrome. There is a neural feedback loop between the teeny weeny little tendons and ligaments around the tailbone and our sense of moral culpability. With the tailbone even subtly curved under, we feel like a bad dog. I'm a bad dog. With the tailbone even subtly flared, we feel like a good dog. I'm a good dog. How dare you say I'm not this or I did that? Don't you know that I'm a good dog? How could I do something wrong? That's called defensiveness. This has consequences in community life. It's worth spending time with this in our own body, freeing up our own tail and feeling how the position of our invisible tail shifts our posture, the tilt of our head, the width of our shoulders, and definitely our tone of voice. It's worth spending time just practicing holding yourself accountable, like for a month, practicing not shaming yourself in bad dog mode, not going into the defensiveness of good dog mode, just being a simple, relaxed, tailbone down, accountable dog. Only when we ourselves are able to stand as accountable dog can we hold others accountable without blaming and shaming them. Blame is not uplifting or ennobling. Being held accountable is ennobling. The very same words spoken from shame and blame land very differently than when spoken from clean accountability. I am here, ready to be accountable dog myself. Will you join me? If anyone would like to spend more time on this, doing role plays and practicing how to stand and live and communicate as accountable dog, including with those who are of higher rank than us, I'd be happy to hold another gathering to practice this. And believe it or not, that's just part one. So take a moment to just shake a little bit, because that's just been a lot in our body. Give it a couple of bounces and a breathe and a Allah. Okay, part two. Put a hand on your heart and please put another hand on the low belly. And I mean low, below the navel. We're going to talk a little bit about the low belly, a place so tender, so sweet, so powerful. If we had more time, I would present a fuller background as to the various teachings about this location and its meanings. However, here is a short practical version. Just as the spine and the accountable dog tailbone are a living axis that keeps us in touch with our inborn moral compass, this wonderful place in the low belly is the seat of our natural ethics, which is why it is very important not to be dissociated or cut off from this place. When we are not in touch with our natural seat of ethics from the inside, we can't feel our ethical response. Then all that's left of ethics is a bunch of inflexible and uninspired rules to follow. We need both morality and ethics for clean and holy accountability. Stay with your hand on both heart and low belly, because I'm going to take us to a place that may hurt a little bit. This low belly place is a very childlike part of us. It's the part of us that experiences genuine pain and distress if we see one child hitting another child with a shovel or calling them a nasty name. There's something in the pit of the belly that goes, ah! Keep a hand there, because what an incredible aspect of your being this is. How proud I am to know you as someone who has not exiled or erased that child. When we are in touch with this child self, it's like another pair of eyes down there that can look out, even over Zoom, and see the other caring, ethical children in our midst. When others are also, however tentatively, empowering and connecting from that place of natural ethics down in the low belly, we can sense about each other, okay, I can feel okay with you. Because if you ever did hurt me, you'd be sorry. And of course, the converse is true. If someone is dissociated or cut off from this part of themselves, it's easy for them to hurt others and not feel anything about it. Thank you for staying in touch with your low belly seat of ethics in community life. Thank you for not cutting off from that place in yourself that allows you to feel your impact on others. I am so glad to be in community with you. Ethical awareness is a commitment to showing up relationally in this soft place. It's a commitment to not being what I call emotionally hit and run. Being emotionally hit and run might include flinging strong language at someone, shooting flaming arrows of truth, even standing in righteousness, but not in caring. That's emotional hit and run. That and any other example of avoidance of showing up empathetically to experience the impact of our words and our actions. Ethical accountability means that if I hurt you, I'm willing to notice. If I hurt you, I'm willing to feel it. I'm staying connected. That's ecological, not hit and run. And this natural seat of ethics doesn't mean that we won't make mistakes. It means that our natural ethical response is alive. If I make an owie on you, ow, ow. If we even see an owie taking place in front of us, our ethical commitment is to stay connected enough to notice, not hit and run, and say, oh, I'm sorry. What can we do? Ethical awareness is not the same as moral compass. Moral compass gives us backbone and the ability to take a stand on our values, even when the whole world around us says otherwise. Moral stance is not relational except with a law. It's the degree of alignment in our intention. By contrast, our ethical sense is all about impact. Before we look at how these two different aspects of accountability intersect, take a moment to feel it in your body. The accountability of the ethical child in the low belly that hurts when we hurt anyone, versus the accountability of not a bad dog, not a good dog, but a simple, upright, accountable dog. We have both right here in our own body, and we need both right here in our own community. Let's look at some examples of how and where and why we need awareness of both. Can anyone think of any examples from community life where both intention and impact needed to be considered as two separate aspects of accountability? Hasaba spoke up and said, my cousin Ed's fiancée was devastated when he was 20 minutes late for a date with her. When he got there, she was furious and crying, you don't love me. Why should I marry you? My cousin Ed is not an emotionally hit and run man at all. He really felt the pain that his lateness caused. He was anguished when his fiancée said, every man I've ever dated has started showing up late like this when they were right about to dump me. So when you do it now, it's just like one more dagger in my gut. Hasaba continued, I can see how in this example, ethical accountability alone has turned Ed into a guilt-ridden walkover whenever his actions cause anybody any pain ever for any reason. And that's not reasonable. We are never completely responsible for someone else's impact from what we say or do. Also, Ed was late because he got caught behind a fallen tree on a back road where there was no cell service. He couldn't call. He was morally straight, yet there were still painful repercussions for his fiancée. I see that Ed needs more backbone so that he can ask himself, how out of alignment was I? Was what I did wrong in the eyes of God? These questions bring a much needed balance to the accountability conversation for a soft-hearted man like my cousin Ed. The community discussed this and other examples for a while, and everyone had a chance to consider the complementary differences between moral and ethical accountability. Howla reflected, I always thought that if I had a hadith to back me up, I didn't have to care about the consequences of my actions. I've memorized more than 100 hadith just so no one can tell me what to do and what not to do. Layla said, you've always had a very strong backbone, Howla, and your command of hadith is exceptional. But I admit that it has put a strain on our friendship at times when I didn't feel like you noticed or even wanted to notice your impact on me. I haven't known how to talk with you about it until now. Howla considered. Yeah, she said heavily. I guess I can be kind of hit and run sometimes. Hit and run hadith, shouted Saeed. This led to a great community discussion of how we can sometimes leverage doctrine, scripture, or hadith as a way of dodging the more relational aspects of accountability. A surprising amount of suppressed resentment was released as people found new ways of talking about and resolving old patterns in the community. Further, it was a great relief to everyone to realize that there may or may not be a clear degree of correspondence between the nature of our impact and the nature of our intentions. There may be barely any relationship at all. We may be way out of alignment, totally not straight, but our community may not mind at all. In fact, they may want to join us in our error. Or, like Hasaba's cousin Ed, who was late for his date for entirely honorable reasons, we may be completely upright and yet someone was hurt. This recognition of moral straightness in our actions and intentions is not more important nor less important than the ethical considerations of impact. Both belong in the conversation. Both belong in our body and in our community. The question for the moral body is, was I in alignment? The question for the ethical body is, who was hurt in this situation? Was it 100% necessary? Or could we have done something differently and still been in alignment? Howla asked, but wait a minute. If everything looks different, depending on whether we're looking at the situation morally or ethically, how can you figure out who's right and who's wrong? Abdul Ghaffar and Hasaba looked at each other and then they both said at the same time, you can't. Hasaba said, a good reckoning is not about blame. Often nobody is completely right or completely wrong. Accountability is an opportunity for everyone to look at what happened and take responsibility for our part, including how we can do better in the future. Abdul Ghaffar added, what I now understand is that forgiveness blossoms like flowers in a garden where accountability has pulled out all the weeds. At this point, Howla asked, hey, when people say, you hurt my heart, what does that mean, morally and ethically? Saeed shouted, when people say you hurt my heart, what they mean is you hurt my nafs. Several people laughed. A few looked very shocked. And Layla said, when people say you hurt my heart, what they mean is I want to feel that you care about your impact on me, and so far, I don't. Howla admitted, well, sometimes when I say you hurt my heart, what I mean is you're behaving like a total asshole and I can't think of a polite way to say so. Saeed said, yeah, but you hurt my heart can also mean you're not behaving like my ideal mommy or daddy, so I hate you. I'm not even sure what's bothering me, but I'm sure it's your fault. Layla laughed, but then said very firmly, let's take a best case scenario here. When people say you hurt my heart, what they mean, perhaps on an unconscious level, is I'd like to have an accountability conversation. I'd like to understand the intentions behind your words and actions, and I'd like you to understand how I was impacted by your words and actions. Then we can both look at our own level of accountability in this interaction. The community agreed that from now on, when anyone said, "You hurt my heart," this is what they would take it to mean. From that point on, in this community, hurt hearts always meant that accountability was on its way from all directions. At this point, Maryam, Thea, Elijah redirected the conversation by asking Abdul Ghaffar and Hasaba, "So, in light of the difference between forgiveness and accountability, and in light of the two different aspects of accountability, what makes a really good apology?" Abdul Ghaffar said, "A sincere desire for the restoration of the flow of grace between hearts with no separation." And Hasaba said, "A highly specific communication of regret for any harm done, a practical plan for the remediation of said harm done, and a mutual agreement about how similar circumstances might be handled differently in the future." Everybody laughed appreciatively at how Abdul Ghaffar and Hasaba so perfectly reflected the qualities associated with their names, with Abdul Ghaffar most concerned about the forgiveness aspect of the apology, and Hasaba most concerned with the accountability aspect. Hasaba and Abdul Ghaffar smiled at each other fondly, and Hasaba said, "I guess the point is that they are both equally important." Howla said, "I guess that the best apology is whatever's going to satisfy the person receiving it." Saeed interjected, "No, no, no, that's not a practical way to think about it. Because unless the person is named Abdul Ghaffar or Hasaba, how would we know which aspects of the apology are going to be most important to them? We're going to have to learn to make apologies that cover all the bases." So the community set to work then and there to create the Unity Apology, a guide to how to make an apology that covers all the bases. Here's what they came up with. Unity Apology. 1, a clearly expressed, sincere desire to do the work required to restore the open flow of grace between hearts with no separation, not just a patch-up job. 2, a clearly expressed understanding, caring, and remorse as to the nature of our impact on others, low belly, ethical accountability. 3, a clearly expressed recognition and remorse as to where we were off in our behavior, i.e., our inner experience of how we were not straight, backbone, moral accountability. 4, a sincere offer of a new behavior and/or reparation process. And 5, a request for feedback on our apology. Is anything more needed for resolution with regard to both earthly accountability and divine grace, no separation between hearts? Everybody was feeling really great about this new understanding of forgiveness and accountability in community life. Hawala and Saeed were making extremely comedic, exaggerated apologies to each other, and Layla was taking notes in her journal for some apologies that she now felt ready to make, because she now felt much more clear as to what she stood accountable for and what she didn't. Various other members of the community were also chatting with each other and looking very pleased with the proceedings, when Maryam, Thea, Elijah interrupted to say, "Don't get too confident yet. There's still one more big subject ahead of you, and that is accepting the responsibilities of the person who receives the apology." Saeed shouted, "But we now know how to make a bomb-proof apology. We rock!" "Yes," said Maryam, Thea, Elijah. 9 times out of 10, you rock with the bomb-proof apology. However, there are times when, even if someone makes the most sincere and complete apology, sometimes our heart does not open right away. There may be hard feelings that just don't disappear on cue. This is natural and this is common, but it can be awfully hard to accept, and even harder to be honest about it, including within ourselves, because usually these hard feelings are not entirely rational. Often we can't even explain them clearly, and if we feel rushed to forgive before we've worked through our hard feelings, we start getting very cantankerous and unreasonable. Even if everything has been going very well up to this point, hard feelings can still throw the whole mediation into a ditch. I had an experience with this where until recently, I was unable to work through something with a beloved in community because I just couldn't get past the ways that he very painfully reminded me of my brother. I could not handle it in the midst of the conflict that we were having, and my heart shut down. It wasn't until just recently, many months later, that I had worked through enough of that inner pain to be able to come to him with tears streaming down my face to apologize for not having been able to show up and meet him as his heart deserved to be met. The grace of forgiveness flowed between us immediately. And on the level of accountability, we are still very carefully looking at our next steps. The situation is delicate because our hearts are delicate, but we can handle that now. Whereas back when the whole situation first erupted, I didn't even know why I was so upset. He kept telling me that I was triggered, and I kept saying, I'm not triggered. You're driving me crazy. I'm not proud of that. In some sense, this whole teaching is my Tauba process being made public. My hard feelings were like a jumbled ball in my chest, so there was no room for the grace of forgiveness and no capacity for clean accountability. I was ashamed of feelings that I didn't even want to admit to, so I reacted outwardly with blame because back then I didn't know how to recognize hard feelings. When I say hard feelings, I mean more than just strong feelings. What I mean is feelings that it is difficult to be honest about, even with ourselves, and that cause us to harden our heart because otherwise we just feel too vulnerable. In my recent example, I was seeing my Sufi brother's beauty as a man and as a soul, and I was feeling like he's beautiful and I'm not. This is an all too familiar feeling for me. It was way too embarrassing to admit, even to myself, so I got angry and exasperated instead. I wish I'd understood then what I understand now about hard feelings, so that I could have said, it's not you. We still have an accountability conversation pending. The issues themselves are not resolved, but I'm in the grip of hard feelings, and I feel way too vulnerable to go there directly right now. Most hard feelings come down to a sense of subtle rejection, that it's too painful to admit, especially in front of the person by whom we feel subtly rejected. As CD says in Music of the Soul, page 68, everyone wants the love, but in their own way. For instance, maybe the other person loves us as a Sufi brother or sister, but doesn't consider us to be the most amazing, wonderful person they've ever met. Ouch! Or they don't consider all of our ideas to be fascinating enough to want to hear us talk about them for half an hour when they are busy or tired. Ouch! Or they still don't want to be our beloved, or they aren't interested in spending as much time with us as we want to spend with them. It's really difficult when that happens. Most of us can hardly stand it. But it's embarrassing to even know that that's what we're feeling. So it's easier to stuff it and then be mad at the person for something that we can't really resolve. Saeed shouted, "Hey, this is what I was talking about with the whole you hurt my heart routine. What? You don't love me? Fine, I hate you forever. You hurt my heart." Layla said, "Saeed, when people say you hurt my heart, at least part of the time, they are saying that more ethical accountability is needed. They feel disregarded in some way. Remember hit and run hadith?" Saeed said, "Yeah, but the other part of the time, it's just hard feelings." Maryam, Thea, Elijah continued, "These are not just hard feelings. Hard feelings can be very strong. And often these hard feelings bring us all the way back to our earliest childhood. They can go really, really deep. So it's very important to acknowledge them with dignity as part of our healing journey. I want to emphasize dignity here, Saeed, because when we have hard feelings, we're at our most vulnerable and undignified. That's why we get so self-righteous on the outside. It might be time to say, hey, are you having hard feelings? So am I. Let's take a break from the issues while we each work separately with the hidden emotions first. So when someone makes us an apology, first we have a responsibility to give them feedback as to whether the apology is complete and to be very specific and clear with that feedback. We also have a responsibility to recognize when the apology is complete, but we are having hard feelings, and that's what's holding up the flow of grace between us. As a mercy, we have a responsibility to look at where we have hard feelings between us that actually have nothing to do with the other person's accountability. These are tender, tender places where healing is needed, and no one else can do it for us. It's a mercy when we can recognize in ourselves, I'm having hard feelings. It's a mercy when we can say to the other person, it's not you. I have some hard feelings that I need to clear first before my heart is ready to reopen. When the healing comes, then the doorways of forgiveness open too. Saeed said, Howla, after all these years, I forgive you for not finding me stunningly handsome. No hard feelings. Howla replied, oh yeah? Well, I forgive you for not considering me way more tactful than you are. No hard feelings. Saeed stood up and said, oh yeah? Well, I forgive you for... Layla interrupted and said, the best medicine for hard feelings is strong vicar. I think it's time we began. They all agreed that it was time to make thicker. And I agreed too. The end.
That was an extraordinary teaching, Maryam.
I am glad for the laughter.
And I will go out on a limb here and speak for Minnesota and say that I think our community would be willing to create an opportunity for you to take this in an expanded form to the Tarka, and or maybe find some larger venues to bring it to more people.
I'd love it. I'm passionate about it, and I'm passionate about my partnership with you guys.
As are we. So thank you very much for this wonderful, extraordinarily beautiful teaching today.
Thank you for receiving me. There was no small amount of personal vulnerability involved.
Mm.